Hi, this is Ken Adams, and welcome to this edition of the Valley View. This week, our guest is Lee Coyne, who is a community catalyst. And I've asked Lee to come on to the show to talk a little bit about aging issues and also those that care for the aging. Lee had written, I thought, a very good article in the Statesman Journal talking about giving caregivers a break periodically. And this is something that I know from experience, and I've seen it in my family where people just kind of get worn out from taking care of one or sometimes both parents.
Right.
So welcome to the show, Lee.
Thank you, Ken.
So maybe we could start off the show by talking about some of the aging issues that you see quite often.
Thank you. Yesterday, which was December 10th, Human Rights Day, the League of Women Voters and the UN Association, bolstered by the City Human Rights Commission, had its annual Salem Speaks Up forum. I participated in that. And one of the things that is closest to my heart is ageism. We cannot become black or Hispanic, or unless we have certain surgery, we're not going to be transgendered. But we all become aged if we live that long. And so it's in our own best interest to pay attention and wake up before our brains and our political will atrophies, if I could use that word. And so I think that we have to look ahead and not fear aging, but cultivate a social climate that has a more comfortable aging. There are more rich aging people there were today than there were 20 or 25 years ago. So the problem of years ago, there was a fear that older people would have to eat dog food, actually, and sometimes steal it from supermarkets in order to survive. I don't know if you remember that era.
Well, that was back in the 60s, and that was part of, I mean, for my memory, is that there was some discussion about, poor older folks were eating like cat and dog food to supplement their diet.
Okay. 1965 was the crucial year. Lyndon Johnson was president, and they passed, in the aftermath of Kennedy's death, not only the Voting Rights Act, but the law that gave us Medicare and the Older Americans Act. The Older Americans Act created senior citizens. It started the Meals on Wheels program, gave special legal services to older people, and that was the beginning, opening round, shall we call it, of helping the older people to raise their standard of living, give them access to more services, and really pay attention that they count in society as well.
Right. And I mean, it's kind of interesting, too, because a lot of times you'll hear people bad-mouthing Social Security and Medicare and like that. But, people have worked, 40, 50 years. They deserve to have some time where they're not stressed, And the other part of that, too, is I think a lot of people don't understand that, like, when you support your older people, or unemployed too, for that matter, you're creating a floor for the economy because you have this money being spent on things that kind of drive the economy. And so that is part of it that quite often doesn't get discussed. And especially like today where they're talking about cutting back on unemployment. But I mean, they're also talking about trying to cut back on how much Social Security is raised each year due to inflation and like that.
Okay. I want to take up the area of homemakers and home attendants and all. In 2004, I wrote my first guest opinion for the Statesman Journal, and that dealt with how caregivers, particularly home health aides or home attendants, as they sometimes call them, do not work for the state. The way the system works then, so the state can spare itself liability, is the state collects a list of interested people. They give them exactly 1 day of training. I think it's maybe the Home Care Commission at this point. And that 1 day is supposed to absorb everything, and then it lets the state off, because then the older person, and I did this with my wife, goes through a list, only name and phone number, and checks their own references. There's nothing like a drug test, and I mentioned drug tests because the older person can be vulnerable to theft if they hire somebody who has a drug history and is looking for an opportunity to steal something to support that drug history.
Sometimes there's criminal history involved too. It's
No,
not,
the state does that.
oh, the state does?
Yeah,
Because I've
that's
seen...
the only, they get references and they get a police criminal history so that they don't put anybody who has a criminal record on the list. But the reality that we don't like to face is that people on the criminal list are only criminals that have been caught. If
Right.
they've evaded the thing and been clever enough to get somebody else to take the break or just be unapprehended, there may be more criminals outside of prison than inside of prison, but we are loath to admit that. Think about that one.
Well, yeah. I mean, there's a lot of ways, though, you can break the law.
Okay.
But, I mean...
I'm just saying, what if?
Yeah, but you raise a point about the fact that it's back on the individual to then
Do the screening.
do the screening. And like, if somebody's not real thorough in that, they could end up with problems.
Right. Originally, the assumption was that the older person would turn to their children and the children would help them do it. But there's so many cases that children do not live near their elderly parents anymore. And so the older person who may have vision difficulties, cognitive difficulties, hearing difficulties, they are infirm, and the reason that they need the home care attendants is because they are fragile. Why do you ask a fragile person to screen for themselves when they're not capable of doing the things they used to? They're in the weakest position to do a competent job of self-protection. So it's a vicious circle. And I think the state is remiss in not recognizing that publicly. And I call on Governor Kitzhaber and his staff to look into that. If you're listening, here goes, Mr. Governor. I know he just announced a re-election, so maybe you could include that in your campaign. Otherwise, your opposition candidate might.
Well, the other thing, and you brought this up in your article, is that caregivers, it's a very stressful kind of job, actually, if you take it seriously. And they need to get breaks periodically. But then with an older person, sometimes they don't like that change. So you end up with other kinds of problems. But we really need to take care of our caregivers as well and give them periodic breaks.
Let me bring another thing into the equation. Elder abuse. It's whispered about. It's not all that much considered on the same legitimate level as child abuse. It could be just as widespread, possibly, but because an older person is dependent very often on a caregiver or a family member, they might not want to get them in trouble.
Right.
Also, they may be on medications, they may forget things, and so they may not be in the ideal position to issue a complaint or grievance against theft. I had a situation where I worked in Maryland for a certain social agency, very interesting thing, and it was a poignant and sad ending. There was a grandson who had a girlfriend, and I think a baby. He forcibly moved into his grandmother's home, also was a drug addict, admittedly a drug addict. He shook down his grandmother and took a good chunk of her Social Security check every month, but would she complain? No. We were trying to get the goods on him, and he worked off the books fixing cars. One day he was trying to fix a car in front of his home, and they had this car, and it was a Ford or Chevy, on cylinder blocks. And unfortunately, the car collapsed on him and he died. That was the only way we were able to end the abuse of exploiting his grandmother's checks. It's a very sad but poetic justice end to a story of grandma being shaken down by her grandson.
Yeah, and that is...
And it happens.
Oh, yeah. I think that actually quite often it's the children that you have to be concerned about.
Sometimes.
Yeah, and because there's a family dynamic sometimes that gets involved, and sometimes grudges are held for a long time, and I've seen that, and but I mean, it's kind of a issue that, like you say, nobody really wants to talk about or doesn't get addressed very often.
Under the rug.
Yeah. And why is that, in your opinion?
Why is that? Is because the older generation sort of has a sense of loyalty. I don't know if older women are more closed-mouthed than older men, possibly so, because they're used to being protective of their children, since in most families the mother is the stronger bonder with the children than the father. The father's out
working.
Although mothers now work.
Yeah,
just do
but I mean, in the older generation.
In any event, they're so used to protecting, even, the kid that goes to school. Who gets to write the note to the teacher trying to get the kid off the hook? Usually the mother, not so much the father. There's a little dynamic in there,
right?
Implicit. And so we have to understand that mothers are not trained to be all that assertive and complain about their own kids. So it's almost like asking them to be disloyal and give up their role of protector to their children. And the children, you even have situations, I'm sure you've run into them, if the children commit a crime and go to prison, the mother still tends, in most cases, to be loyal and make excuses for why it happened. And only a minority of mothers will condemn their kids for going astray. Is that not true?
Well, yes, I've seen that on numerous occasions. And, and like, I guess parents' love is kind of unconditional, that they are, that's their child no matter what they do. Mm-hmm. But they'll still sometimes see that their children have gone astray and try to do something about it. But that is a very difficult thing for a parent.
Now, as you get older, you get more fragile, usually. Hearing, shortness of breath, the whole gamut of things, balance. And so the older person becomes dependent on somebody. If the caregiver is a son or daughter-in-law, it's almost like a reverse umbilical cord, if I could express it like that. There's an invisible emotional attachment of dependency. I like the term reverse umbilical cord, reverse navel cord. And so as a result, the older person is afraid that cord will be severed if they blow the whistle. It's very hard to be a family whistleblower, in effect. There is Adult Protective Services. Everybody write that down. Adult Protective Services, you call up the information operator, or you call up the senior center here in Town Center, 50 plus, and they could put you in touch with Adult Protective Services. So if anybody suspects abuse, neglect, or exploitation going on against an older person, they need to call Adult Protective Services. That complaint can be anonymous, and the inspector or investigator for the APS will go out and interview and verify whether there's any grounds to that allegation.
What are some of the signs of elder abuse? Because it's
hard to quantify.
Yeah, but are there some definite signs that you can?
Well, for one thing, for example, doctors and dentists and nurses are required reporters of suspected abuse. So if they see black and blue marks or some major thing about the person walking, something that would indicate a physical encounter with someone, unless there's some proof that it was a fall, which sometimes they try to say, it could be a sign of being roughhoused by a relative or a caregiver for not playing the game according to the caregiver's
or trying
rules.
To force them to
coercion,
behave in a certain
coercion,
way.
Force, exactly.
Right.
So you have that. They could be very hesitant in talking and stutter and otherwise seem very nervous and not want to discuss and change the subject at all if it comes up. And I think these are some of the signs that could be. I would actually be in touch with somebody, let's say from a nursing home ombudsman, and ask them, because they deal with these cases inside nursing homes. By the way, a lot of people don't know that retirement homes throughout the state of Oregon do not have the same oversight that nursing homes have, because they don't have a medical component. It's considered almost like a senior citizen hotel. So if an older person feels abused or neglected within a retirement home, it's a much harder way to confront and file that grievance. There's no ombudsman for retirement homes. A lot of people don't know that. It's important to know. I would, if I were sending my wife or other relative into a retirement home or nursing home, I would ask the Better Business Bureau or the State Health Department, if it's a nursing home or assisted living, what the track record is of that particular place, allegations. The same as I would ask if I were getting a doctor. And a lot of older people simply take doctors or recommendations of their friends, and they don't really know the nitty-gritty. Let me touch on doctors, because that's another very interesting thing that older people are dependent on. The website will tell you very superficial information, a doctor's medical school, year of degree, where they did their internship and residency. That does not give you an update of what the doctor has learned lately. If you and I, who are geriatric generation material, were to want to find out if that particular doctor, he or she, has had courses in geriatrics recently or something equivalent to his specialty. Let's say you or I had a urology prostate problem, for example. We don't know specifically if that doctor has had courses that relate to that, and we're just because the doctor has elderly patients does not make that doctor expert in dealing with geriatrics, and that's the gap in the lineup. I would call for legislation that would require that the continuing medical education courses be put on the website for every doctor. That would give much more information. Maybe the medical society would support me, maybe they would not, I don't know. But I think it's a consumer's rights issue, and you and I are consumers. And so are most of the people out there listening to the show today.
Yeah, it is kind of interesting because I see,
Yes.
Like my doctor, but they send me out to specialists when it's other things, and and I feel fairly comfortable with who's being recommended and like that. But it's not always the case, because I know a lot of people that are retired and like that. They've been going to the same doctor for a number of years, but he maybe hasn't re-educated himself to his older patients.
Exactly.
But they feel comfortable with them and might not realize that he doesn't have a lot of experience in that area.
So they're just going by the bedside manner,
Right.
not the nitty-gritty of knowledge. And that's a self-disservice,
Well, that's one of the things.
It's almost like going steady with someone who you've dated for a year because you're afraid to try someone else on the market, even if it's in your own best interest. You're sort of going steady with the doctor.
Well,
it's not a romantic, hopefully, type
hopefully,
of thing.
yeah.
Hopefully not. That would be unethical. But it's the same kind of, it's over-bonding and over-dependency. And it's almost like a doctor addiction. You're addicted to a certain person, and you're afraid to change.
Yeah.
That's your fix. I know that's a hard word to use for the medical profession, but I think most of us understand what we're talking about.
Well, it also, like I know from personal experience, several of my doctors have retired before I did. And they were my age or younger. And so,
Right.
that was a little disconcerting that they're
Yes.
getting to retire and I'm still working.
Right. There's even a little tongue-in-cheek joke that I'm so healthy I'm going to dance over my doctor's grave. And it happens to some people.
Well, yeah. I remember my first doctor, he hadn't had a vacation in years, went on vacation, died of a heart attack. And that's when I was very young.
I don't want to badmouth all or most doctors, so I want to give something positive here too and share how I have learned to bond with my doctor at Salem Clinic, but it could be any doctor, and anybody could borrow this. I want to avoid the pitfall of the Mount Olympus doctors up there and I'm down in the valley, that kind of authoritarian type of relationship. So inevitably I ask my doctor where, in this case, he went to medical school, what was his hardest course that he took, is it still serving him well, and are there any courses he took in school that seem to be obsolete in the present field. I try to talk to the doctor on his expertise and not put all the focus on my illness. And, I try to make him more of an equal to me instead of being all the way on top of the mountain. And it eases the conversation. And I love to kid and banter with doctors. For example, when I had a catheter put into me, I'm not going to demonstrate on TV, of course.
No, please don't.
Okay. When I had a catheter, I renamed it plastic spaghetti. And the urinary retention bag, hear this audience, was renamed golden nectar receptacle. The doctor had a good laugh at me because I was using my journalistic creative powers and making light of it and not letting myself be cast in the role of victim. But I was playing a drama of my bladder being semi-dysfunctional. We won't go into the nitty-gritty today, but I wanted to go with the flow again, as the saying goes.
I did have a catheter at one point, and I asked my doctor if it was going to hurt when he took it out, and he says, it's not going to hurt me a bit.
Did he lie?
He said, it's not going to hurt me,
right,
the doctor, a bit.
Oh.
So he was making a joke about it.
I see.
And he had a way of making me feel comfortable about things.
Good.
But it did hurt. So, and
let's continue the bantering.
Yes, and I mean, what can be done for caregivers to make sure that they're not burning out? Because this is a topic that or personal experience that I've seen several times played out.
Okay. Caregivers need to understand their people first and caregivers second. And when going into caregiving, I think this is true for any profession, you should know your vulnerabilities and be able to, none of us is God, but God supposedly rested, did his work for 6 days, and the 7th day he rested. I would hope that a caregiver gives himself or herself the same opportunity to rest at least one day a week and have somebody else come in. One of the things that could be done is you have neighbors who can cook and contribute a meal so that the caregiver doesn't do that. There may be somebody, it's almost like babysitting, but more responsible, so that you can go out to a movie or some other
fun
recreational
activity.
event and all. And I would love to see the fringe benefit that caregivers are given massages to ease up their stresses. I don't know if that will come in my lifetime or yours, but I'm a strong believer in that. I am also a believer in pet therapy. What is pet therapy? And I would love to see different places, even state and city government, try that. Instead of a coffee break where you load up on caffeine, I would like to see a pet room where you could take a 10 or 15-minute break and you could pet a cat or a dog or a bunny rabbit or tweet with a canary or something like that and loosen up by relating not to obstinate, nasty, mean people, but the more civilized kingdom of pets. And it's really a relaxant. And we have never, as a society, taken that seriously. At home, we love our pets. And I think it would help productivity in the workplace to have a special room where people could deal with animals even for 10 or 15 minutes and during a work break and resuscitate themselves, battery recharge. Am I sounding too idealistic for you?
Well, no. I mean, having lots of pets in my household, it's something that is relaxing. You know, like you're petting a cat or a dog, and like the cat will be purring. And I've seen studies where it's a benefit to both the cat and the human doing the petting. It kind of reinforces. And I've seen that with dogs and like that. And it does relieve tension, you know, and it is, I think, a good stress reliever. And I just, I have well, it's not my cousin, it's my wife's cousin, but he and I are fairly close. And he was taking care of both his parents by himself. And he would have to call me up periodically to just talk because, you know, it was very, very stressful for him. This went on for like 4 or 5 years.
Safety valve.
Yeah. And so that was something I could do because he did live kind of a distance away from me. But it was kind of the same thing. It gave him a chance to talk about stuff that he liked to do, you know, and what was going on in his life and what kind of problems he was having so that maybe I could make suggestions to him and like that. But I do kind of actually think that having some sort of pet for the caregiver would help reduce the stress. And I mean, sometimes, you know, the people you're taking care of aren't problems. It's just, it's a stressful thing because they have health issues. They have, you know, they're kind of fixed in their way of doing things. So trying to accommodate them sometimes can be difficult. And it's not like the person is trying to be a problem, but it's.
Okay, let me address that in a minute. I want to take this opportunity to give my email so that if anybody has any suggestions above and beyond anything that I've conveyed today, I would love to hear from them, or critique my suggestions, if you will. The name is Lee Coyne, but my email address, feel free to write it down, Lucky Coyne, LuckyCoyne, last name, at yahoo.com. I'd love to hear from anyone in the audience, pro, con, in between. I'm not looking for praise, I'm looking for feedback, which is different.
Or if maybe you can help people with some advice too.
I could.
Yeah.
I could. For many years, I was a medical social worker, New York, Maryland, Virginia, New Mexico, and ultimately Oregon. So I went cross-country. And it's an interesting thing, and there are certain similarities and there are certain cultural variations. For example, in New Mexico, I was able to mobilize my Espanol and talk bilingually, Spanish and English and all. And when I worked with the Cubans at St. Elizabeth's Hospital in D.C., many of whom were really inmates with criminal histories, I'll say in Spanish first, es fácil jugar con el diablo, pero es peligroso también, which means it's easy to play with the devil, but it's also dangerous. That was my opening words to my clientes, my clients from Cuba. Very interesting to talk about that.
Well, yeah, and you were born in Brooklyn and lived...
Brooklyn, New York, don't talk that way no more. Still got my street smarts, man.
Yeah. But I mean, going to Maryland, Virginia was probably something of a cultural shift for you.
Not really, because the thing about the D.C. area is that more than half of the people are transplants from around the country. There are very few native Virginians in Northern Virginia. I lived in Arlington at the time.
Oh, okay.
Actually, I was a member of the Arlington Commission on Aging, which kind of chugged up my thing. By the way, I should mention that I inaugurated Sunshine Line, which is the first use of conference calling to homebound elderly in the country, I believe. I started it in Queens, New York, and I took it down to Arlington, Virginia. And what we did is we linked up 7 or 8 Meals on Wheels people at the same time from the list, and we had a guest speaker, usually a person who spoke to the well elderly at the senior center, and then did a double header, namely that the conference call operator put them piggyback one after another until we got 7 or 8 of them, and I, knowing them, introduced them to each other. And one lady named Rose, my original client from 1975, said to me, I quote her, I quote Rose, "It was like closing my eyes and all these people are together in my living room." Beautiful testimony from that client.
And I think that's something too that's important as you get older and you somewhat get isolated sometimes because you're housebound, is to have connections with other people, your peers, or just other folks around. So I want to thank you for coming, Lee, and it's very educational.
Thank you.
And I want to invite folks to come back to Valley View next time, and we'll be discussing a different topic. Thank you.
Thank you, my good man.